Well, good evening. Good evening. Earth Day 365. So this is the latest offering through the virtual Earth Week 2020 festival. And I am Mitch Leachman, the Director of Programs with the St. Louis Audubon Society, and looking forward to talking about gardening for birds and other wildlife today. A very brief introduction, since this is a subject that I've personally taught small adult education classes, 3 hours at a pop, that sort of thing. But we're just going to scratch the surface. I hope to provide not only a little bit of knowledge, but some specific ideas. I've got several slides that I'll pause for a moment when I get there with some very specific ideas. You can make a note or screen capture, or for that matter, queue up the video later. Also, I will have some resources at the end of the talk. And finally, do intend to leave some time for questions if you have any. Before moving in, I'll just quickly note the three logos on my title slide. And one is the St. Louis Audubon Society, my employer, and the owner of the Brain Conservation Home Program, which is the second logo, and that is a consultation service. We actually provide detailed written recommendations to individual landowners about doing this very thing, and that's one of the resources that I will highlight later. And then the Missouri Department of Conservation, which many of you may know about, a state agency here in Missouri, a wonderful organization that supports nearly every one of our environmental nonprofits and organizations here in the region, and they specifically have tremendous support to our Brain Conservation Home Program. So what do I mean when I say gardening for birds and other wildlife? Ooh, what's that other wildlife mean? You know, like squirrels and, you know, I don't know, possums, although possums I think are really, really cool. But small wildlife, think small. Birds are sort of the focus of the St. Louis Audubon Society and other Audubon-like organizations. But you garden for birds and you get caterpillars, you get moths, you get butterflies that are not all monarchs, frogs, tree frogs. You get other insects with all the attention to butterflies and bees and things. Beetles are really, really cool. And moths come in all shapes and sizes. This is a hummingbird moth. And yes, there are birds as well, and this is a summer tanager. Now, when I say gardening for birds and other wildlife, what would I possibly be meaning when it comes to, again, this whole notion of nature sanctuaries and things? Are we getting wild and crazy? Well, you can get wild and crazy, but you don't need to be wild and crazy. You can simply garden, use all of the skills and techniques that you may already know, and simply utilize the right plants and put them in the right places to support birds and other wildlife. It is gardening. Some would call it landscaping, which is a little bit broader of a term, but I'm perfectly fine and comfortable with either term. And you'll notice people as well, right? Pretty plants, pretty spaces, pretty landscapes, and for people too. Now, what is not wildlife gardening? It's not boring. It is not a traditional landscape. A traditional landscape, when it comes to wildlife, is typically boring. You could be proud of a space like this. You could be very comfortable with a neat and green and tidy and an accomplishment like this. And I'm not criticizing this type of space, but I am pointing out and emphasizing that this doesn't really do anything for birds and other wildlife. Now, to do this gardening, to do this landscaping, we need native plants. Native plants have evolved in our area, and they are the key. They're the single most important factor for your nature sanctuary, your gardening for your birds and other wildlife. Now, why? Why we need native plants is because, and this will take a couple of slides to get through the full concept, but we need native plants because all of our songbirds eat insects. Insects are a critical part of their life cycle. Specifically, our songbirds, those insects are the essential protein that they need to feed their babies, for their babies to grow and build muscle and bone. So this phenomenon of protein for growth and development of young is not unique to birds. Clearly humans and lots of other animals also require protein during the development of the young. I emphasize songbirds because if you were to look at and talk about, say, hawks, eagles, or owls, they still need the protein for their babies, but they don't need the insects so much. They will use other animals to get that protein. For small songbirds not equipped to capture other animals, insects are a highly efficient and readily available protein source for their young. Now, we emphasize caterpillars, the young of the larva stage of butterflies and moths, a lot in this thought process and this approach to landscaping, because the prevalence in the number of caterpillars that are out there, the butterflies and moths. Also, they're a very readily available food source, as in soft-bodied. They're not going to fly away when a bird tries to catch them like a beetle might or a different type of flying insect. So again, we need insects for the birds. Just to emphasize this point a little bit, a study was done a number of years ago. Some very poor, unfortunate graduate students had the task of monitoring a nest of chickadees. They had to make a note, write down, take photos, and estimate how many caterpillars that family of chickadees used in order for those babies to mature over just a couple of weeks. Standard feeding time, 2 to 3 weeks for small songbirds. It's huge, huge, thousands of caterpillars feeding on native plants for, again, these small songbirds. Now, how do we get the plants out of this? Where do native plants come into this? It's all about specialization. It turns out, not surprisingly, if you are being consumed as a prey organism, you have to have a defense mechanism. A rabbit that is pursued by coyotes or other animals runs away or camouflages or is active at certain times of the day. A mourning dove that hawks might pursue, the mourning dove can fly away. So all organisms have this defense process. Somebody has to escape in order to reproduce, in order to continue the generation and make more prey animals. Well, how does this work when you're a plant, when you can't move, when you can't escape, when you can't run away? If you're a plant, you have chemical defenses in your tissues. This is not unique to one particular type of plant, but what this means is for the critters that eat plants for a living, like these caterpillars, they have specialized. They have figured out how to get past certain chemical defenses and therefore specialize in certain plants. The photo on this page shows a monarch caterpillar, and a perfect example of intense specialization, since the only thing that monarch caterpillars can eat is milkweed. Now, back to gardening. What did we fill our landscapes with in the last several generations? We filled them with non-native plants. We brought in, for the most part, plants imported from other countries. They're neat, they're pretty. Some of them flower, some of them don't, but hardly any of them evolved here. In the insects that evolved to eat them were left in their home country. So we really need to look at reintroducing native plants as a supplement. If you like some of your non-native plants, you like your turfgrass, that's great. Look for opportunities to add the native plants. We need the native plants to support those insects that the birds and other wildlife require. So just a couple of pictures just to emphasize the point. Again, cardinals, chickadees, and yes, even hummingbirds. Even hummingbirds looking for insects during their breeding period when they have babies on the nest. They take those insects back to the nest, caterpillars, flies, gnats, tiny spiders, protein packages to feed the babies. Really important point. So two slides here with plant examples. So this one is just a quick and dramatic illustration of what we were just talking about. And the numbers you're looking at are how many different species of butterflies and moths have been seen feeding on each type of plant. Okay, so this is across North American continent, and researchers continue to tally and add up every time they find another species feeding on each type of plant. So common native plants on the left, common non-native plants on the right, and you quickly see the value of the native plants in the quantity, the diversity, the abundance of butterfly and moth caterpillars, insect food for birds and other wildlife that the native plants support. Again, common non-native plants. If you like your hostas, if you like your daylilies, fine, keep them. Just understand that they're not wildlife plants. They're not supporting birds and other critters, and see if you've got a space in your yard to add the native plants. So this is the same information. This is just getting more detailed. There are no non-native plants on this slide, and this is just giving you more insight into a greater array of native plants, shrubs, trees, perennial flowers that are all great sources of insect food for our birds and butterflies. Now, just to reemphasize, right, or to put an illustration to it, you know, traditional gardening is on your left, wildlife gardening is on your right. Wildlife gardening, again, the insects eating the plants, so holes in leaves is an aesthetic that you'll become comfortable with, because you know that means that insects are out there, they're eating the plants that they're supposed to, and they're potentially being food for birds and other critters. When there are no holes in your leaves, neat and tidy and pretty and everything intact, there's just not a lot going on. It's likely a pretty boring landscape. Now, talking about the insects is really emphasizing reproduction, is really emphasizing the breeding season. But clearly birds and other wildlife are going to need food in other seasons. They're going to need food in the summer, in the fall, in the winter, in the early spring, before the insects come out. So all of our birds are looking for fruit at different times of the year, and native plants can be used to provide the fruit as well. This is a cedar waxwing on a serviceberry tree. This is also a serviceberry tree with an immature robin feeding on the same fruit. So I'll pause again for a minute here. So I got one more slide like this. This is the second of the 3 series. So bird fruit. So this is not all of the native plants that provide essential fruit to birds, but it is a pretty good selection. These are all versatile plants. These are all readily available. And you also see 3 different seasons emphasized. So the season that the fruit on that plant is primarily available and ripe and ready to be eaten. So if we have insects during the breeding season, especially, we have fruit through many seasons. The other primary type of food that birds and other wildlife are really looking for in our landscapes is seeds. Here's a goldfinch on Coreopsis. Truly a build it and they will come sort of plant. This particular species of Coreopsis, there are several that are commercially available. The very first growing season, they were planted, the plants put in the ground in probably early April. In that summer, this photo was taken of the goldfinches eating the seeds in the very first growing season. Here's a very bright inbreeding plumage male goldfinch taking the seeds of cup plant, a native sunflower. So, forgot I had a third slide here. So those were goldfinches feeding during the bulk of the breeding season, but again, the fall and winter especially are really, really important seasons to have the seeds available. And here's a white-throated sparrow perched in some New England aster during the snow in the middle of winter. So here's the last slide with lists of plants on it, just like the fruit. slide. This is not every native plant that's going to provide seeds for the birds, but it is a very good assortment of them. It is a very good representation, very adaptable plants, different types of plants on here, and in many cases, not even a specific plant. In other words, coneflowers. There are many different species and kinds of coneflowers available. Coreopsis come in a number of different species, same thing with asters. So just to be clear, now it might be obvious, it probably is, but just to be clear, in order, especially on the seeds, to provide those seeds, we do have to leave the plant material out, right? If we do fall cleanup and cut back all of our plants going into the winter, then of course there's nothing available for the birds. So we do need to, at least in some places where you're comfortable leaving that plant material, let the birds find it, leave it out there for them, because this is clearly not helpful. There's nothing left in this garden bed. So again, native plants, that is the single specific, most important, broad, overarching point we're making today here in this introduction to gardening for birds and other wildlife. You need yourself some native plants somewhere in your landscape in order to make this happen. So how to make it happen? So we'll wrap up here with a few minutes on some resources. No matter where you live, including in the St. Louis area, but anywhere across the country, should you pick up this video at another time or be watching from another location. These are two great resources online. The Plants for Birds program through National Audubon, and then the National Wildlife Federation has a native plant finder program. In both of these tools, you can go to their website, you can put in your zip code, and you can start checking boxes of what types of plants you're looking for, what type of space you've got to fill. Very, very helpful tools. If you are in our region, the St. Louis, Missouri area, here's 4 really cool local resources that can really help you out. I mentioned the Conservation Department earlier, the triangle there. They have an amazing array of resources online, as well as free publications that you can either order from them or pick up from a location once we're able to go back and do that again. The Wild Ones, there's actually 2 chapters of Wild Ones here in the St. Louis area, and they are garden clubs. They're regional garden clubs for native plant people. And just take that for what it says. It's a very literal interpretation of what they do. It's an amazing group of folks and a wonderful resource to be a part of. And then Grow Native has a great website. They got a wonderful native plant database on their website. They have a number of plant templates and design guides on their website, which can be very helpful, again, especially when you're just getting started. And lastly, I'll close here with a couple of slides on our Bring Conservation Home program that I mentioned earlier. So historically and traditionally, we have provided house calls for habitat, or habitat house calls. This procedure, of course, is not currently underway with the pandemic, but we have just finalized a new set of protocols that will allow us to do a personalized consultation for every landowner remotely, actually using a Zoom call. So we will stop by your property on our own. We'll let you know we're coming. We will zip around the landscape and take a bunch of pictures. And then we will hook up with you later by Zoom call. We will talk to you about what we see. You will share what your interests and goals are and any frustrations you have. And then we will provide you specific written recommendations. We will email you a report about how you can improve your landscape based on your goals and your interests, based on the site conditions in your landscape, and of course, based on primarily the use of native plants. So I emphasized people in an earlier slide when we were looking at what is gardening. We're looking at the garden examples of native plants and wildlife sanctuaries. So these are just a sampling of the 1,200 landowners that we have assisted with gardening for birds and other wildlife in their landscape over the last 8 years. It's a lot of fun. People tell us that they find it very helpful, and you might as well. Should you be interested, here's some information. Here's a web address. There's an online request form. There's my email and phone number should you want to ask any questions or reach out to me directly. Again, the program has been on hold for about a month, but we now have a new set of protocols in place where we will be able to restart the program. I am going to stop the screen sharing. So you're looking at me instead of the PowerPoint slide. Before I just ask if there are any questions, I'm going to remind everyone, again, this is part of the Virtual Earth Week Festival through Earth Day 365. And this is the end of, day 3, I believe. So there's, 6 more days to come of an amazing array of programs. So certainly stay tuned to Earth Day 365's Facebook page or check it on the website. And I will be doing that myself later this week. So I'm going to just stop talking and see if my Earth Day moderator has any questions for me.
Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen any questions come in, but I have a couple questions for you. Can you talk a little bit about why this is important to landscape natively for birds and other wildlife?
Yeah, so it's important because there are now too many of us. I mean, that's my way of saying that the spread of humans and all that we do in this country and around the world is just so great that we really need more. We need to revisit, we need to bring the birds and the butterflies, we need to bring them back into the spaces where we've pushed them out of. The national parks, the conservation areas, the state parks, the wildlife refuges, those are really important spaces. There's a lot of them. They're always going to be really critical, but there's not enough of them. Our impact has grown so great with the spread of suburbs, with the spread of highways, parking lots and so on. And even setting aside just sort of, oh my gosh, the big giant message like that, it's just so much more fun and it's so much more engaging and so much more inspiring to have this sort of stuff, to have the monarch butterflies, to have the summer tanager, to have the hummingbird moth, not just at a park, but to have it in your garden, to have it in your own landscape, to have it at your church, to have it at your school. I can't talk enough, and I try to emphasize as much as possible, and that's also why I started with the first series of slides of different critters. Those have all been seen in this yard. I took most of those photos, but every one of those critters have been seen in this 9,000 square foot suburban 65-year-old lot in Maryland Heights. That's here. That's just because we're gardening for wildlife and gardening with native plants.
Cool. And then what would you say for people who have an apartment and limited space? Can you make some recommendations about that?
Yeah, so certainly the smaller the space, the fewer your opportunities. But I technically got my start with this whole thought process, like 25, 30 years ago when I was in Washington, D.C. suburbs. And I rented a third of a townhouse. And we had a tiny little postage stamp backyard. And I put New England aster in the backyard. I didn't know what I was doing at that time. I really had not a clue. Little did I know New England aster was going to be the very first plant that I put at the house here in Maryland Heights after I found and bought. Even apartment patios, container gardens, there's a lot of different plants that can grow in pots, right? So even if you don't have turf, right? Even if you don't have ground to work with, patio gardens have great opportunity. They may need to be restarted each year, just depending upon your capacity to overwinter those plants and how big your pots and that sort of thing. But just because your space is small doesn't in any way mean that you can't participate in this as well.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else have any questions? We can maybe give it a second. See if anything else comes through.
Inspired anything. Or left them wanting, right? Left them wanting and having more questions. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity. We are looking forward to our second live event this coming Thursday. One of my partners is going to be presenting Introduction to Birding. But we really, I mean, we've been a part of the Forest Park Festival for a number of years, and we're really pleased to get the personal invite, and so happy to see the array of folks and companies and organizations that are participating in Virtual Earth Week. So thank you.
Thank you. Can you remind people when your second session is, Introduction to Birding?
If I'm not mistaken, it's Thursday at 11, Thursday morning, 11 a.m., Introduction to Birding.
Thank you. Thursday the 23rd. Cool. Well, thank you, Mitch. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.